thank you, Momentum, and everybody who's tuning in right now for this incredible opportunity during these really strange times. Just here in Israel alone, the government is considering a nationwide quarantine for 14 days so that, God willing, will just be over and done with this coronavirus. And as a result, though, tourism just doesn't exist here right now. So I am totally grateful and indebted to Momentum for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of my knowledge with all of you here today. And exactly what are we going to be doing? Well, we are going to go on a virtual tour through the land of Israel, and we are going to learn about some of the archaeological proofs out there that prove the Bible as a historical work. So the first place that I want to visit is Jericho. Now, Jericho is one of the oldest cities in the entire world, and that's because Israel, as well as Lebanon and Mesopotamia and the ancient empire of Egypt, is where humanity first developed into civilized colonies and developed huge metropolitan areas, and we have trade. And as a result, throughout Israel, you have this archaeological phenomenon known as a tell, which is where people settled in the same area over time, and it built what is known as stratigraphy, layer upon layer upon layer of civilization. And so Jericho has been excavated many, many times by various people. So for those of us who are a little bit unfamiliar with the biblical story of Jericho, I want to go and have a little bit of a review. So first of all, the Israelites are traveling throughout the desert for 40 years, led by Moshe, and they get to the Jordan River, and Moses is told to go to the top of the mountain to Har Nebo, and he is going to pass away. And now the Israelites are led by Joshua. And Joshua, along with the rest of the Israelite society, mourns for about a year until they're told that the time has come to cross the Jordan River to enter the land of Canaan, and that the first city that they are going to have a war with, to go to battle against, is the city of Jericho. And you could just imagine what that must have been like. You know, the entire Israelite nation crossing the Jordan River, and they're in this, huge, wide open desert, and they're looking at this massive city with these huge, formidable walls, and they must have scratched their heads and thought to themselves, how in the world am I going to be able to, never mind defeat that city, but to even put a dent in those walls? And that's when they got the nevuah. That's when they got the prophecy, as the book of Joshua tells us. And they are to circle the city and blow their shofars, and the walls of Jericho will come tumbling down. So where does the archaeology come into play with that? So as I mentioned, Jericho has been excavated several times by various people. But I want to focus on one archaeologist and excavation that took place in 1990 by a man by the name of Dr. Bryant Wood. Now, Dr. Bryant Wood was already a very interesting individual. He was incredibly intelligent, and he went to school and earned a bachelor's degree and master's degree in mechanical engineering. And he had a great job with General Electric, and he gave that all up to follow his passion, to follow his heart, which is obviously something that's very commendable. And his passion was archaeology and the Bible. And he earned a doctorate degree at the University of Toronto in archaeology with a focus on Canaanite pottery. So Dr. Bryant Wood, you can see over here in this slide, let me just back up here for a second, in this slide over here is that you can see him excavating, and he's got some help of the local Bedouin and Arabs in the area. And you can see lots of pottery. You can see bowls and plates and cups. And he sent this into the laboratories, and they did their carbon dating. And he determined through the carbon dating as well as the way that the pottery was made to date back to the 13th, 14th century BCE, which is the time period that, according to the chronology of the Bible, that the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and went to war with Jericho. So first of all, in case anybody's confused with the term BCE, that's the academic term. Oftentimes in America or North America, really throughout the world, you hear terms like AD and BC, which are really Christian religious terms, AD meaning the year of our Lord and BC meaning before Christ. So if you believe in Jesus, God bless, use those terms. If you don't, maybe you want to use the academic terms, CE, the Common Era, everything after the year zero, or BCE, before the Common Era, everything before the year zero. So he dated this layer of Jericho to date back to the 13th, 14th century BCE, before the Common Era, which, according to the chronology of the Bible, is when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River. That's discovery number one that is so amazing that he made during the excavations of Jericho. The second amazing discovery is the walls themselves. Is that when he studied the way that they were destroyed, it did not look typical to the way cities were destroyed at that time. You got to remember, people were not flying in F-15s. They weren't flying around and bombing cities. Things weren't just blowing up into smithereens, but rather they would come with battering rams. And they would come to these and they would have to literally push the wall in. So oftentimes in archaeological excavation, you could see where the walls were breached. But here it looked as though the walls were split in half and came tumbling down. Amazing. But the third discovery he made is on that layer of stratigraphy. Remember, it's a tell, right? Civilization upon civilization upon civilization, kind of like an onion. You just got to peel that away. The more layers you peel away, the older it gets. So he's peeling that away until he got to that time period, which we believe is when the Israelites, according to the chronology of the Bible, entered into the land of Canaan and went to war with Jericho, that there was a layer of ash and sediment and burn marks on the stone. Now, according to the Bible, that the conquest of the land of Canaan, in the book of Joshua, there were only 3 cities that were burned down, and Jericho was one of them. That's incredible. But you have to remember, is that when I was in my tour guiding course, it wasn't the rabbis or the spiritual leaders that were taking us out in order to learn the biblical narratives and the proofs of the Bible, but rather it was the scientists, it was the archaeologist, it was the geologist, it was, the people who studied in a scientific way the history of the land of Israel. So they weren't necessarily religious. In fact, the individual who was teaching my course about Jericho was atheist. He did not believe in God. So when we got to Jericho and he's telling us these stories, he's like, and we know that this is how it happened, I had to raise my hand. And even though at that time I was not observant myself, I said, well, what about these miracles? And he says, David, it's a great question. I thought the same thing as well. But when you look out onto the valley, which Jericho is located, and we can see here in this next slide, you can see that Jericho sits roughly about 400 meters below sea level, whereas Jerusalem would be somewhere around 900 meters above sea level. And then you got this massive valley. And if you look at that slide on the right-hand side, you can see that there are more cliffs and more mountains that are going up on that right-hand side. So you have this deep, deep valley that runs in between what is today Israel and Jordan, known as the Arava Valley, the Dead Sea Valley, moving up north, the Jordan Valley, then you have the Kinneret and the Hula Valley, and it keeps on going up north. He said this valley was formed by the world's largest fault line, known as the Syrian-African Rift. It goes from Mozambique out there in Africa all the way up to the foothills of the Taurus Mountains in Turkey, running 3,600 miles. So he said what must have occurred is that the Israelites crossed the Jordan River. They're standing in the middle of this vast desert, a sandbox for all intents and purposes, looking at that city and scratching their heads. How in the world are we going to be able to not only defeat this city, but put a dent into the walls? And that's when, like, oh my gosh, the entire world is shaking. There's a massive earthquake. Now, one thing you need to know about earthquakes is that if the ground does not split open underneath your feet and there's nothing to fall on your head, you're going to be okay. The worst thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to fall over. So the Israelites, being out in the middle of the desert, simply fell down. By the way, this slide that you're looking at right now, this is a picture from a movie called San Andreas depicting the fault line in California. It is a computer graphic, but it does depict what I'm talking about. The earth split open. You can see there's a gas station there, and it's falling into the earth. If that doesn't happen, you're just going to fall over. The Israelites get up, and they look at the city of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. But not only that, is that in ancient cities, there were always fires that were burning, cooking people's food and for the pottery and blowing glass and for various reasons. These fires spread. Meanwhile, the people who are inhabiting the city, the walls of their homes and the ceilings are falling down, knocking them upside the head. They are concussed. They don't know which way is up and which way is down. They're running around looking for their children, and these fires begin to spread, depicting exactly the way it is recorded in the Tanakh. So you're talking to a religious guy here, right? I believe in the miracles. Maybe you believe in the miracles too, or maybe you don't. But either way you look at it, the focus here is that archaeology and science has now proven that the biblical narrative of the story of Jericho, right? You want to take out the way it happened, right? Whether it was miracles or an earthquake, or maybe you believe God caused the earthquake, whatever it is, the story happened. The Israelites crossed over. The city was destroyed. The walls came tumbling down, and it was burned to the ground. That's amazing, because for me, at that moment in my life, it was the first time that I took the Bible as being something that was another piece of ancient fiction like Greek mythology or something, and it moved to the realm of a historical work. And then I thought to myself, well, it's not just my history. I mean, it's not just history. It's my history. It's your history. It's the Jewish people's history that you know without a doubt that your great, 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 and however many greats, great grandparents were there during that time. Like, that is amazing. So we can see, we have the historical evidence, and it's throughout the land of Israel. You can go to the city of David. You could go to Chatzor. You could go to many, many different places. And all you have to do is open up your Tanakh, is open up your Bible, and you can see exactly the way it's described, and you can see the layout of the land, and it is all there as a proof to the historical reality that is depicted in the Bible. But let's move forward, okay? Just a little bit further down, we have a place called Qumran, which is a Second Temple period community that was built by a group known as the Essenes, a sect of Jews at that time. And one of their practices is that they would write all of the different books that are in the Torah, right, on scrolls. They wrap them up, put them into these clay jars, and hide them into the caves that are scattered throughout the Dead Sea, right? You go down to the Dead Sea, anybody who's been to the Dead Sea or Masada already, you know that there's these caves along the wall. They hid the scrolls in there. Now, fast forward a little bit further, maybe 100, 150 years, the Romans come here, they destroy everything in the land of Judea and the land of Israel, and the Essenes are never to be heard from again. What the Romans did not realize is that in those caves was a tremendous amount of treasure that would not be discovered until 1947, when a Bedouin who was shepherding his flock had lost one of his sheep or goats, and this young boy, knowing that if he returned home to his father without one of the livestock, he was going to get a licking. And so he started taking rocks and throwing them into the caves to listen to see if you could hear the meh, something, an animal making a noise. Rather than hearing the animal, he heard something shatter. And he must have thought to himself, my gosh, I discovered gold or emeralds or diamonds or something. Let me run up into that cave and, claim my bounty. And when he got there, he was disappointed because all he found was some old rolled up leather parchment with Hebrew writing on it. He went to the market and sold it to a sandler who could use it for repairing shoes or, for whatever he needed it. That sandler, realizing like, hey, these are ancient manuscripts, brought it to the archaeologists and they began to sell it in the back of magazines. That's when this budding state of Israel, again, this is pre-state, but this budding Jewish community said, we need to get our hands on that. And we ended up purchasing them all. You can see some fragments here, heavily damaged. Most of it was damaged like this. We had to piece it together to form complete scrolls. Some of them, like the one you can see right here, were more intact in better condition. But what was so amazing about this archaeological discovery, and it might be the most important archaeological discovery here in the land of Israel, but really maybe for mankind. And that is because Western society is based on Jewish values, right? We call them, in America, North America, we call them Judeo-Christian values. The values which our societies in Western society were built on comes from the Bible. And here we can see a Bible from 2,000 years ago, when matched up to the Bible we have today, only has a handful of discrepancies. Now, think about that. A handful of discrepancies from a Bible that was written 2,000 years ago from a Bible we have today. The printing press was not created or invented until the 16th century, the 1500s. Up until that time, everything is written by hand. Now, Sefer Torahs are still written by hand, but they're also printed, right? You can go buy a Bible, or if you go to a hotel, you could find one, in your drawer next to your bed. Once they're printed out like that, there's no room for discrepancies. So from the year 0, let's say, when this scroll that you're looking at in the slide was written, to the year 1500, there's only a handful of discrepancies. Then there's probably only a handful of discrepancies from when it was written, 1500 BCE, 1400 BCE, to the year 0, which means we now have proof, physical proof, that the same Torah that we have today is the same Torah that our grandparents were reading, whether it was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or if it was during the time of King David, 3,000 years ago. And that's something you need to resonate with and really capture when you're celebrating your children's bar bat mitzvah, or your friends' kids' bar bat mitzvahs, or you go to synagogue on Saturday and you hear the rabbi reading from the Torah, and you're like, that section, which we call a parsha, has been read by our ancestors for thousands of years. And what's so incredible is that that section, that Torah portion, is still so relevant today. Now, I want to move on, the little time that we have right now, to Masada. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, wait a second, David, Masada doesn't have anything to do with the Bible. And you're right. There was no prophecy that was had there. There were no miracles that were performed there. And yet, everybody visits Masada. It doesn't make a difference if you're Jewish, if you're religious or not. Christians go there. Asian businessmen who are touring here for business reasons only visit Masada. Everybody goes to Masada. Why? We know the tragic story. At the end, everybody dies. So what is the message of Masada that everybody is trying to capture? I go there and I see older people, they'll bend down and they'll pick up a stone, they'll rub it between their hands and they'll put it in their pocket. They're going to go back home, wherever they're from, and put it on their mantle above their fireplace. Why? So I never really understood that until I took an incredible class by Rabbi Noach Weinberg, who taught a class known as the 5 levels of pleasure, that human pleasure can be broken down into 5 categories. The most simple is physical pleasure, right? You're hungry, you eat, you're satiated, great, awesome, right? You go running. What do you get if you go running? They call it a runner's high, right? You feel great. It's a physical pleasure that's easy to capture. What could be better than physical pleasure? Love, right? Love is awesome. And then my rabbi said, this is where most people tap out, right? Most people achieve this 2nd level pleasure, the pleasure of love, right? Or 4th level pleasure, depending on which way you're going, right? Is love. What could be better than the love you have for your spouse, for your parents, and as we know, your children? And that's when he said, living a life with purpose and meaning, not just sometimes, but all the time, day in and day out. Here in Israel, I believe most of us at least, and hopefully you as well, live with that type of pleasure every day. And the proof is that we actually send our kids to the army. And when they go to the army, we know that there are going to be we lose soldiers here in Israel every month. And yet we tell them to go out for the best unit possible, knowing that they're going to risk their lives. Because having our homeland, having Israel is that important. It's that meaningful. It's that purpose in which we exist for. And as a result, Israel is actually ranked the 11th happiest country in the world. That's awesome. And I think the people at Masada knew what they were living for. They lived with purpose and meaning so much that they were actually willing to die for it. So if you know what you're willing to die for, if you can just live for that just a little bit every day, we can increase happiness that I know we all need a little bit more happiness in these trying times, because these are difficult times around the world. So we all need to support one another a little bit more, to bring happiness into our own lives, happiness into our families' lives. And hopefully this short webinar, this little time that we've had together today, has brought a little bit of joy and happiness and inspiration and food for thought for all of you. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in. And I think really right now we have some time for a little Q&A. So what do you guys say?
Hi, David. Thanks so much.
Hey, Judy.
Questions. Yeah, thanks. First question, what are 3 places you would suggest to go on a family trip in Israel?
Well, hopefully if you're going to come to Israel, you'll go to more than just 3 places when you visit. You know, the way I map out my trips for families when they come here is I like to build up to Jerusalem. First and foremost, you have to be in Jerusalem. If you're going to be in Jerusalem, you should be here for Shabbat, because you witness something that is just incredible. It's amazing. It's near miraculous. When you have Jews from all walks of life, you know, Hasidim from Meir Sharim with furry hats and big long black trench coats, to, you know, soldiers and what I think in America they probably say modern Orthodox, Dati Lomi, and people coming without kippahs, and women and tourists and everybody coming to the Kotel on a Friday night for Shabbat, all celebrating the same thing, which is life. That's the purpose of Shabbat, is to remind us what's important in our lives. So obviously Jerusalem first and foremost, right? But I like to warm up to that idea, and I like to first go up through the coast. I love this place called Kfar Kedem. It opens up the oral Torah, it opens up the Talmudic period, it opens up the land to our ancestors, and it helps in a easy way, not just, you know, kids, but adults well, to tap into that important time period that we call the Talmudic period. And of course, you get to go donkey riding, and you get to make your own bread and your own cheese. So very important place. The Golan Heights is really important. You get to learn about the various wars. It's also beautiful, and you have waterfalls, and just to see the sheer beauty of the land. I mean, it's the size of New Jersey, and yet you have all this diversity. So it's really incredible. I know I've mentioned 3 already, but I think also coming down and seeing what I just talked about today, and the Dead Sea is also really important. To be able to walk in the lowest place on earth is just incredible. And it really opens you up to go from waterfalls to the Dead Sea is just extremely dramatic.
Great. The last question, do you know of an online course on Judaism starting from biblical times that at the same time discusses what is going on in the rest of the world?
You mean simultaneously, like what was happening during the days that the Bible was happening, and then what was happening in different parts of the world?
Yes.
That's a great question, great idea. We do have a museum here in Israel. It's not biblical. It goes, you know, throughout the narrative of modern Zionism from the 19th century all the way up to modern times, and what was happening around the rest of the world. So the concept is brilliant. But as far as an online class is concerned, I'm really not too familiar. Unfortunately, I can't give you an answer on that. I learned all my information through books and through the course that I took, which is a 2-year program here in Israel to actually become a tour guide. But I will say that over the course of the next couple months, if you guys want to be in touch with me, my schedule is somewhat opened up that I hope to be able to produce something just like that, because I don't know if it exists, but I hope to be able to produce something similar to what you just asked and hopefully be able to put it out on my social media.
And one last question, which,
Great.
what is your favorite Israeli food?
What's my favorite Israeli food? I'm a bit of a foodie. I love food and I love Israeli food. That would be a really difficult one for me to answer. It's like if you're stuck on an island and you could only have one meal, for the rest of your life, what would it be? Um, if that was a reality, it probably wouldn't be my favorite Israeli food. I think the food that I'm the biggest snob about, and that I really appreciate, a really good shakshuka, which is a great Israeli breakfast of poached eggs in a tomato sauce, but it could be made in so many variations. I make it all the time.
Thank
Mine's
you.
probably the best.
Thanks so much.
And
Adrian?
you're all invited to some. As soon as you guys come to Israel again, you're all invited to my house. You can have some shakshuka.